Hey, Jalen, thank you for joining.
Hey
All
guys.
right. Good evening, everyone. This is the October meeting of the Ad Hoc Affordable Housing Committee for the Norwalk Common Council. With us today are committee members Jalen Seed and Nicole Eady and myself. We are short of a quorum at the moment, hoping that a couple of other folks will join. In the meantime, oh, it looks like we're having someone join now. Um, all right. In the meantime, Michelle, maybe we should move on to our first item while we wait and see who else is joining here.
Heather's
Um,
coming on.
oh, great. Hi, Heather. How are you? Thank you so much for joining. I know that you're in between things, so we will appreciate if you are able to join or not. All right. Michelle, I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that's sufficient for a quorum since Mr. Burnett is no longer a member of this committee, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so given that we have quorum, the first item of business is under 3A, the regular meeting minutes of July 24th, 2025. Does anyone have any corrections, additions, comments on these minutes? Okay, seeing none, I will call for a vote. All those in favor of accepting the meeting minutes? Okay, that looks unanimous. Thank you so much. Our next item of business are the meeting minutes for September 18th. As all of you may recall, we had to cut this meeting short because unfortunately the public could not access our meeting. So all those in favor of accepting the meeting minutes for, oh, sorry, any corrections, additions, deletions? Sorry, Michelle, while people are looking at that, can you move Nicole Ayers into the meeting? She's in the public participation.
I'm assuming her name's not popping up, but it's Serving All Vessels Equally Inc. or
Yes, I think that would be her. Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, I had to Google that. I wasn't sure who that was.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Terrific. Thank you so much. So all in favor of accepting the meeting minutes for September 18th? Okay. Any abstentions?
Yeah, I abstain.
Thank you, Mr. Seed. I appreciate that. All right. Then the meeting minutes are accepted. I don't see any public, or sorry, excuse me. Public participation is next on our agenda. So is there anyone from the public who would like to speak?
I see a hand
Great.
raised. Let's bring him over. Just state your name and address for the record, please.
Hi, Lisa Britton, 19 Shorefront Park.
Hi, Lisa.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to speak tonight.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, because we couldn't get in a couple of weeks ago or a couple months ago. It's been a while.
Yeah, it was a month ago. We tried very hard to reschedule, and unfortunately, there were no available dates without conflicting meetings. So here we are.
That's okay. That's okay. I watch. I pay attention. What I have to say isn't going to come as any surprise to any of you guys because I know I'm a broken record and I've made sure that I've made this an issue for the mayoral campaign, and that is, I'm all for more housing and the human element of all that stuff. Obviously, my concern is being the financial person here in the city. I am I'm simply concerned about tax abatements being able to match up with our bank account and obviously being able to fund the schools. I'm on the record as saying I support senior housing. I support housing if it's, for singles. Anything that isn't going to put more of a strain on our existing school system, because we seem to be more amenable to developers and tax abatements for housing, and we seem to ignore that it's part of that housing funds our school system, and that is unlikely to change anytime soon. So, yeah, that's just my biggest point is that I know, and we've never actually talked about this because everyone's kind of forgotten over time. And I know Johan likes to claim that POCO was a success, but just, those AMIs back when POCO first came about, 20 years ago, they were in the 30 and 50 percentile. And I think Steve can correct me on some of this stuff, but the AMIs were so low, the project was never financially viable. I think the AMIs have been changed for POCO, and we've added more less parking and more apartments and stuff. But just whatever we bring in has got to be sustainable for the city and or not put more pressure on the city. And like I said, predominantly the schools. So senior housing, I'm supportive of, singles, but any bringing in more families with poverty for a school system that we won't support is just compounding our issues. So I don't want to seem like a uncaring individual. I'm just trying to, mind the store. So that's all I want to say tonight. And I thank you guys for letting me speak.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. Is there anyone else who wants to participate?
Yes, Diane Cece.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Diane. How are you?
Hi, everybody. I'm good, thank you. I trust you can hear me.
We can hear you. Yep.
Thanks. Yep, I saw the agenda and I'm hopping on so that I can actually, what I want to do is listen in to these updates and your discussion. But then I just heard Lisa Brinton and I'll just say what she said. Literally everything. So I'll be brief and ditto Lisa Brinton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Cece. Anyone else?
That's all I see on.
Okay. Great. Well, we will then close public participation and move on to our agenda. The next item on our agenda is the status on the affordable housing tracker. So Michelle, you want to give us some updates on where we're at?
Sure, and this is kind of repetitive from your last meeting, but I understand. I guess technically we weren't really having a meeting, but there's
Yes,
nothing.
I'm not sure Ms. Cece or Ms. Britton could have heard us last time, so I appreciate the repetition.
Sure. So I'll start with some of the zoning amendments that happened. I believe this was like back in May, I believe. We added a density bonus for over 10 units between if you're doing over 10 units, you could get a 5% density bump if those units are provided at 80 to 90%. And then we did the income increase for the typical workforce housing units. So people that are recertifying that are already in the program, they can go up in income so long that the city's 10% affordability doesn't drop lower than 13 or 12, I believe we put. And then we did a 3-bedroom counts as 2 workforce units to address family size dwelling units. So that's why we put that in there. And then I believe our department is going to be looking at some ADU stuff in the future and tweaking and kind of doing some stuff there, but that hasn't been approved. Just if people aren't aware, we had a tax abatement presentation back in June from Don Poland. He's kind of an expert in the field of that stuff, and he did a great presentation. And there's a Zoom link or a YouTube link available to watch that presentation. And then the last item that we've been working on that's still in the works, but still being teased out on what would be viable are some legislative proposals, which included condo to home ownership. We realized that we want to increase home ownership, and we're trying to unravel why developers aren't doing condos. So we're trying to make some proposed changes in the legislation to address that. We are working on incentives for grocery stores if we want SONO to have people in SONO to have access to fresh food. So we want to be able to possibly make some zoning or tax changes for the city to be able to do that. And then the last one we are working on was a tax sale on delinquent properties. We saw an example in Massachusetts that was doing it and it seemed to be successful. So, but those are all still kind of in the works and nothing set in stone and kicking around. I think that was the bulk of what we had done in the last, over the summer and stuff. So if Steve has anything to add.
No, nothing new, like just some of like the legislative stuff. We're kind of just circling back on that now in the ADU things. We had a couple other projects that we were working on that took kind of a little bit of our summer, early fall, but now we're kind of able to circle back on some of these things.
Great. Thank you both. To that point, I wonder, do you think you would be ready to maybe do a presentation on ADUs in November? Might that be a goal? I know that that's a topic we've been wanting to explore some ideas on. I'm just putting that out there for consideration. We don't have to decide tonight. But that might be good to have a goal. So I appreciate that summary of things. The other thing I wanted to flag, in case committee members have not seen, the Norwalk Redevelopment Agency finally put out the study that they had been doing for quite some time related to South Norwalk. I have to be honest, I was really disappointed in it. It is not what I had hoped it was going to be. In particular, I don't think it really generated any new ideas at all. But I think that's something that committee members should take a look at if you have not seen it already. And we can I can share a link for anyone who's interested. But there is some interesting data in it that I think helps quantify some of the challenges, but the recommendations were thin to non-existent. And I think it really highlights the fact that this is, work that really needs to continue. We need to find more and better and creative ways. And it is not to minimize the challenges. And I think I want to be respectful of the redevelopment agency staff time in regards to that. I think what the study mostly highlights is that these are very complex and challenging problems, particularly without, enormous amounts of money to spend on them. Nonetheless, I do think that some of the community input that was provided at some of the South Norwalk meetings could potentially have been taken farther. And I think there were a lot of good suggestions from folks about sort of specific opportunities that we need to find some way to capture and pursue. And so that may be another topic for, continued work by this committee to see if we can sort of better leverage local knowledge about opportunities. And figure out if targeted investments could help, sort of leverage places that people are sort of aware of as underutilized properties. But I know that was another item we were kind of waiting for in terms of moving the affordable housing plan forward. And unfortunately, I don't know that it's going to produce a lot of additional work So anyway, I think that's just another item I wanted to add in relation to the tracker. Do other committee members have anything in relation to work that has been done or is ongoing or otherwise relates to what we're tracking and sort of trying to move our action plan forward? Okay. So then let's move on to our second item of old business, which is the Affordable Housing Account Ordinance. And Steve and Michelle, do you want to give us an overview, remind us where we are on that?
Sure. I did send out, and I hope everybody got, I went back and listened to the recording from the last time we kind of really got into it in depth to try to get a sense of direction on things. I have to say after listening to a second time, there definitely was not a consensus among the group on which way to go. So Michelle, myself, and Jay Hibansky sat down after we all listened to it again and started just kind of spitballing some ideas on criteria and things that we think would be part of the evaluation of eligible projects. And, we couldn't come to a consensus either on, whether large projects, small projects should get more weight or should not be considered. So I kind of gave two options in terms of what you could do for that. I'm assuming, I apologize, you got it kind of late late in the game in terms of when your meeting was, but I can pull that up on the screen and we can look at it and go through it if you have questions. You don't need to, outside of giving me feedback, there's, obviously no decision needs to be made on it tonight. We can take time and come back and review it at a subsequent meeting and see if the direction's good or just what you would like us to sharpen the pencil on.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if you want to put that up on screen so we can talk about it a little bit. Because I agree that this is, I think it is symptomatic of the challenges we face here, that it is very hard to figure out what would be sort of most effective to do here. And I think committee members probably have a variety of different thoughts. One other thing that I want to acknowledge right now, and this really is for the committee members, we have not yet appointed the committee to sort of receive and review the applications for this funding. And it's becoming a little bit of a chicken and the egg. Until we have a committee, we don't, can't finalize the guidelines. I really would appreciate recommendations. Again, we are looking for people who live in either as renters or owners of affordable housing, and this needs to comply with our minority party representation requirements. And also we're looking for folks who live across the city. So we need 3 people. At least one of them must be a Republican or an undeclared or an independent voter. And at least, ideally we'd get someone from at least 3 different districts in the city. So if you all have names or ideas or suggestions, please email those to me tonight. I'm going to try to work on that this weekend if possible, to really reach out to folks who might be interested. And I know I've gotten 1 or 2 recommendations in the past. I think Jalen, you sent me someone. So if folks have others, let's try to get that done if we can, so that we can involve more people in the debate about exactly what to do with these funds. So Steve, can you just refresh us a little bit, particularly for anyone who might be listening, what are the origins of these funds? What are, what's the history of sort of how we got to this place? Just a quick overview, I think, would be helpful for people.
Sure. So these funds are very specific funds that are allowed by a state statute, that you're allowed to include inclusionary zoning. It's also kind of where we get our workforce housing regulations from, in terms of we require that the developments set aside a certain number of units at certain affordability levels. And the statute also provides the ability to charge a fee for construction projects. So when I was in my former employment, we were the first community in the state to enact that legislation. They take it more broadly than we take it. They also look at like single family dwellings, and then they charge them based on construction value of that. So we restrict it to multifamily, which is 3 or more units. Or now, when the regulations were amended in 2024, we also included commercial developments as well. So if you're building like if we ever got like a new Walmart or something like that, they would have to pay into the fee based on the construction value. So every time we get a multifamily project now, 3 or more units, they are required to, they have 2 avenues really. They can deed restrict the 10% of their units at 60% of the state median income, or they can deed restrict them at 80%. And if they do the 80%, they also have to pay a 1% construction fee. Most of the time they utilize the 80%, because for them over time, they can charge more rent at the 80%. So the math is easier and more profitable for them. They just pay the upfront fee, and then over time, the additional rent would pay that piece of it off. So that's been on the books for, I think I put in my memo and I forgot. It's been on the books for a few years now, and it kind of, the bigger the project is, the more we collect off that. So we have a permit pending for a project that was approved by the commission earlier this year. I just saw the numbers today. That was for 24 Belden Avenue. The fee on the residential piece of that will probably be about another $130,000. So we'll probably get that check in the next week. So I think that puts us probably around $2.25–2.5 million in that fund. So it, even when we get small projects, say somebody does a 6-unit development, we still collect somewhat of a fee, but it's much smaller. So it's going to increase over time, but it's not, it's not going to ever be enough to fund any single project, but it's kind of meant to supplement and support viable projects. So that's kind of like the history and the background of things. So the other piece of the regulations that's relevant is that the fees collected under that program are required to go to development, rehabilitation, improvements to projects where the units deed restricted at no more than 60% of SMI. Jalen, you had a question?
Uh, let me see. Yeah, sorry. So the question I had was like, with that money that we have, is there any way that like we can like put it in a CD or something? So like while we're trying to figure it out, is gaining interest to like just kind of make that money work that way? Or is that already in place?
It's in a. I would have to check with the finance department because I don't know what the legality of doing that is, because it's the fund is supposed to be not touched for any purpose outside of the the affordable housing, for lack of a better term. So I don't know if you're allowed to do that with those kind of funds, if you're allowed. I mean, I don't have no objection. I just don't know if we're allowed to.
Okay.
Yeah, we can
Thank you.
check. Yeah, we can check with Jared. Jalen, my general understanding is that in general, the city does have funds that are not currently in use in interest-bearing accounts, but we should double check that. But we do, because we do get reports way back and deep in the finance documents about interest earned.
Yeah, I remember seeing that, but I
But
just
that's
wondered
something
with
we
this
should
money.
check.
Yeah, with this money, it might be beneficial just to help compound.
Yeah, it's a
it
fair
little bit.
question,
Yeah, we can. we
right?
can
And
certainly
making
follow.
sure that whatever interest is earned, that remains in that account. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that overview, Steve. And I think, since Darlene is ill today and is not here to speak for herself, I will provide comments that she emailed to me today, was to say, and I recognize that, as you pointed out, the deed restriction issue is sort of inherent in the authorizing regulations for this. And so I'm not sure it is a problem we can change or something we can change. But, she expressed ongoing frustration with the limitations of deed restrictions. If the goal is to move towards a home ownership model, deed restriction really, part of the value of a home ownership model is that it builds equity and generational wealth. And if we deed restrict, that really limits the ability for it to sort of serve that purpose. And so I'm just flagging that as, again, sort of a question that she has raised, I know, in the past, and I think it's important to keep in mind whether, to figure out if this is something we can tackle with this, if it's a problem that we need to sort of resolve or refer to kind of other affordable housing approaches. And I will recognize that it is tricky, right? Because you run into the question of the value of deed restricting is making sure that the government investment in this, the taxpayer investment in this, continues and perpetuates and isn't sort of just given to a few select individuals. On the other hand, I very much recognize her point that, particularly if the deed restriction, depending on how restrictive the deed restriction is, it can truly obviate the value of home ownership such that you're not actually really building equity at all. Jalen?
Yeah, that was just kind of my point too. I definitely get the point of the deed restrictions and like my grandparents, they purchased a condo in San Vincenzo in South Norwalk. That was low income, and it's the same thing. Like we were able to, if we sold it now, there's a certain limit to what we could sell it for. Places around that same area are going for much more. But I think the benefit to it is that it keeps that community low income. So if you were to sell it, the people that it creates that same opportunity kind of over and over again. And I think it helps where people aren't just going in and buying it really quick and then flipping it for profit, and then that whole neighborhood isn't affordable anymore. So I think it's kind of that balance of do we want to do this long term or just for a few people, like you said. So that's just kind of not really an argument, but that'd be my concern with the like kind of the limitations of the deed restrictions.
Yeah.
Right, it's a real challenge. And I think this, if we go all the way back to a presentation we had in the spring about the community land trusts, one of the reasons that people have pursued that model is because the goal is to try to strike a middle ground, right? Because the land trust always owns the land. There is some level of deed restriction always in place, but that gives them some flexibility to say, maybe they split the profits. Maybe you sell it at, you can sell it at 30% of what you or some percentage. I don't know. So all of which is to say, like, yes, this is, I think, very much a known problem. And I had told Darlene I would raise her concerns. And again, with these particular funds, it may be water under the bridge, because my understanding, Steve, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we collected them under the workforce regulations, which are deed restricted. And so we have to, as a legal matter, I think we have to carry them through for these particular funds.
Yeah, and I think, that's where I think zoning is one small piece of the affordability problem. There's so many different facets to it that I think, in my opinion, there's always going to be a need for this kind of housing, but that's kind of, we know that there's a certain amount of it that's there for people who are never going to hit that upper threshold. So there's always that band. And then the other piece I think is I think there are better avenues if the city really wanted to look at because I think the home ownership piece of it is really important, and I completely understand. I think there's probably different funding mechanisms that the city can think about if that's something we're more interested in or in pursuing. But I don't think this particular vehicle is the best one for that.
And I think that the legislative proposal you're talking about, just to, again, how it all ties together. Really, one of the challenges is that people have not been building condos for the last couple decades. And so, until we can figure out what it is that is, if we can figure out what we can do at the state or local level to really help incentivize those, because that is so often the starter approach. The way people build equity, is through that sort of first property acquisition. And with a dearth of affordable condos, I think that has really sort of blocked up the pipeline in a way that is really of concern. I don't know, Steve, if you want to say towards, have you guys found anything helpful about sort of what are the barriers that are sort of dissuading developers from building condos as opposed to rental properties?
No, not specifically. I was kind of pretty excited when we first started the affordable housing plan. I was thinking, based on discussions with the consultant team, that maybe we kind of found like a silver bullet. But then as we kind of dug deeper into it, there are some legislative challenges and some financing challenges that make it less appealing for the developers to do that, condos versus apartments. But I don't think that's the specific answer. I think, just conversations I've had with different developers over time is that, say they have a 100-unit building, for them to put them in condos, all right, now we have to do 100 closings versus one closing. So that makes it problematic. There's also the tax piece of it with the closing versus not the closing. There was a whole host of reasons why it was less appealing. But we have seen an uptick in the area, not just Norwalk, but in the pursuit of condos. I was talking to an attorney from Stanford who's seeing some, and then that was followed up by a couple of articles where the couple developments were leaning towards condos versus apartments. And we've talked to somebody recently that's looking at a project near the hospital, which they were thinking about condos. I think it was like a 16-unit project, which would be kind of townhomes. So I thought that was encouraging. And I think there's some more recent evidence where the rental prices are getting so high that that's almost becoming a barrier, and there's resistance to those higher rents, that it might shift back and make condos more viable. But I think, though, with the larger projects, I think more than likely they would, for the most part, would probably stay apartments. But I think some of it too is like where the particular development is. If it's like something where that's in a more, like, I think things near the water, to me, it makes more sense if I had a condo because it's much more attractive. It's got more amenities in the area where I want to be longer term and put some roots down. But that hasn't quite played out yet either.
Interesting. Okay. And this, to reference a point which is on our sort of upcoming new business, right? One of the questions that we really want to think through And this isn't again in relation to Mr. Poland's presentation on tax abatements, right? We have a great deal more flexibility than Norwalk is currently using. And one of the things this committee I think has talked about is, really trying to use the tax abatement authority we have to incentivize condos as opposed to rental properties. And so I think, as we talk about trying to get an ordinance drafted, that would put some guidelines or some framework on what kind of tax abatements we would want to give, particularly for moving away from kind of a one size fits all. If you're in the opportunity zone model and much more of a targeted, if you're achieving the kinds of housing that we are short of in Norwalk. I mean, again, I think that will be very helpful to get feedback from developers as to sort of what levels of incentives might tip the balance in favor of condos, as opposed to rental properties. Because it is an interesting question. I mean, if part of the challenge is, the transfer tax on the initial occupant, maybe that would be an effective tax abatement, right? If we waive the transfer tax for the first closing, not for subsequent ones, but for the first closing, so that they're not burdened by that for each unit. If that is truly an issue that is dissuading people from going condo. All right, so sorry, I'm sorry, derailed a little bit. So let's talk a little bit then about some potential options for the use of these affordable housing funds that we currently have. Again, accepting the deed restriction is probably legally required for the use of these funds, at least.
Sure. So we kind of, again, this was just almost like a conversation starter, kind of broke it into two camps. One being that if you have a building or a project that's got more than 20 units, the maximum distribution you could seek is $1 million. And if you kept it under 20, then the maximum would be $500,000. Now that's just basically in consideration that we have a little over $2 million. And I think any project would suck up $2 million really quickly. So we, want to have the ability to disperse funds to potentially multiple projects. So that this was just kind of some metrics I started with. And then the next section is really talking about the eligibility requirements for the different projects. I'm assuming you guys can see my screen, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Sure. And then it kind of breaks it down again by the two camps, one being the over 20 and one being the under 20 projects. And it has some draft ideas on what you can do in terms of the requirements for the levels of affordability, with 50% of the units, over 20 being permanently deed restricted, with 35%, a minimum of 35% of them being not exceeding 60% SMI, and then at least 15 of those not exceeding 30%. And then it's kind of a similar formula if you're under 20, but just kind of broke the percentage down a little bit differently. I'll get into the scoring criteria as kind of a follow-up section. And then we had some other things where we talk about, whether this project could be eligible or not. It's anything within the flood zone or the CAM zone, we said probably should not be eligible for this. If they have existing violations of health zoning or blight, we said you are not eligible. If you need to get variance, amend the zoning map, amend the zoning or regulations, we said probably not a good idea either. And then, if you can get zoning approval, then you are eligible. You have to be current on your taxes. The proposal has to be compliant with the workforce housing regulations, which is a little bit of a belts and suspender condition, but it's probably a good idea to keep it in there. And then for the deed restriction, kind of speaking about what we were talking about at the beginning, is there's always going to be a need for certain levels of affordability. I think ideal would be to move people to a point where they have their own residence, where they're paying their mortgage and they have a home ownership opportunity. But there probably is always going to be some need for assistance with certain types of housing. So that's why we put that criteria in there. So the next section is really kind of like the first shot at looking at metrics for affordability criteria, and the highest points being 30 points based on the overall affordability of the project. And probably should back it up a little bit with the concept being that the committee you were talking about at the beginning would be the kind of body that's looking at these applications, and then they're the ones scoring these applications and making a determination on whether the project should be funded or not. And to get the funding, they need to hit like kind of like an 80 out of the 100 for the score. And that was going back to school. I guess that's, I don't know if that's still a B. Heather, Miss Dunn, I believe, is a teacher. She could tell me if that's a B or that's passing or failing. So we started with an 80 percentile. So again, the highest grade out of 30 points possible would be based on the level of affordability within the project, the percentage of the units, the kind of the depth of the affordability of those units. And also if you have units set aside for seniors, you can kind of get a little higher weighting on your scoring. Second criteria is relation to where is this project? You know, is it proximate to the train station? Is it on a transit line? Is it within walking distance of, and I put certain zones there, and the reason for those zones is that's, you know, kind of where our infrastructure is, where our employment center is, where our activities are. So the ability to not have an automobile to get to where you needed to go, whether it was a job or something else, is more likely in those kind of areas. And it just makes sense because that's kind of where the city's targeting their growth. So it made sense to line that up with the higher points. Another metric, and they kind of drop down in terms of the possible points, is looking at, you know, the project's built in a sustainable manner. And the reason why we added that as a criteria is because that, you know, overall makes it long-term cheaper in terms of the costs to heat the building, cool the building, and keep it viable. So we have 5 points for, and it's not just, so one thing just to why we use LEED Silver, I should say or equivalent, not of equivalent. But the reason we use just those as the equivalent, the process for certification for those projects is really expensive and kind of time consuming. So what we've done in the zoning regulations and other areas is you have to be able to demonstrate that you can meet the LEED criteria. You don't have to show us that you got LEED certified, but you have to be able to demonstrate. And there's architects with credentials that have the ability to certify that, yes, this is like a LEED equivalent project. So we said the more sustainable you make it, the more points you can get. And I see a little error in my point system there, so excuse me, I'll go fix that. You can't get 15 points out of 10. Next category is shovel readiness. So is this kind of like a viable project? Is the financial stack showing that it can work? Do you have your zoning approval? And then at that point, you've got to be able to get everything going within 180 days. So the idea being that we don't want to allocate these funds and somebody takes 2 years to get their project off the ground. And meanwhile, we could have funded something else that also was a worthy project. And are they bringing other funding to the table so you can get points for that? And then is the project consistent with the citywide plan? Is it consistent with the Affordable Housing Action Plan? And if you're adding for sale units within the development, there are 5 points possible. And then also, are you including family size units? Because that was a need identified in the affordable housing study, and it has been identified in the past. So if you can have those 2 or 3 bedroom units, that's been identified as a need. And the last piece, I think the last piece really talks about the application process. And so this was something Michelle, Jay, and I were kind of kicking around in terms of steps, and it's probably easier to look at it from the kind of chart vantage point here. So, you know, so somebody will have an application form, obviously would be kind of an online fillable form. Someone fills that out, submits all the additional required paperwork with that. And one of those we'll talk a little bit more at the end. And then staff will do a completeness review. What we have 2 options in here is that there's an application fee, and that application fee goes to a specific purpose. And if your application is approved, we would refund those fees. That the fees would go to a third-party financial review. And what we're hoping to do with that is we want to make sure what they're proposing for their overall project is viable. So that, obviously we talked about that the funds available as part of this are not going to go, to build an entire project. So they're going to have to bring in other sources, whether that's private equity or, they can other grants or other things that programs that they look at. So we want to look at the whole stack and make sure that is actually a project that would work before we fund it. And, I don't think there's anybody in the city that necessarily has the expertise to do that. So we would hopefully have somebody on retainer that we could say, okay, here's the plan that they put together. Is this viable or not viable? And we're hoping that we could seek somebody that's kind of looking to help, not almost not on a pro bono basis, but something along those lines where they can just get minimum compensation for their time. But that's something we'll explore. The other option we put in there would be, would the city set aside $20,000-$30,000 in the operating budget annually to pay for that if we wanted to do that ourselves and not charge an application, because that was just something else we considered. So once the application was deemed financially viable by the third-party consultant, then it would go to the committee, and the committee would, get a presentation on the project, kind of similar to what like maybe the Planning and Zoning Commission does. Here's what we're proposing and why. Here's our why we're requesting X amount of dollars, and here's our other funding sources. And then the committee can, take their time and render a decision on the proposal. And then, the applicant, if they get approval, can then, proceed with their project. I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. But
Yeah, well, thank you for reviewing that. It's certainly, I think I appreciate the ways in which it raises a lot of issues that I hadn't really thought through yet about how we would sort of do that. So folks on the committee, reactions, thoughts, feedback?
complaints, you take it all.
Ms.
So-
Dunn?
Can you address Lisa and Diane's concerns in the scope of what this is right now? What this looks like?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So they had a lot of concerns about home ownership and stuff like that. And I guess it would be a good idea to circle back and talk about how we're addressing some of their concerns within this plan.
Yeah, I heard,
Well-
I heard some things. Do you have specific items that they stated that you want to address?
Well, I mean, one of the things was there's a couple points, I guess, given for senior housing and stuff like that. How is that incorporated in there? I think obviously giving extra points for multifamily stuff goes against what they were asking for. Number 10. Percent of units within developments that are for sale. Is that I'd like to have kind of see numbers here. My biggest concern, honestly, is, with the rental things, as we're seeing people that buy in at, a very low level. And I think to Darlene's point, I'm sorry, I also have strep, by the way, that people are going to invest in a property that they have some stake in the game. And, I'd like to see some funds put towards rehabbing or updating properties that have been rentals. Focus on fixing things that people have kind of let fall apart a little bit because they don't own them. And I think the ownership is really important. One of the issues is that, people invest in them and care for them and a little bit more. And so I'd like to see more money focused on that aspect of it, really supporting people who might not be able to have access. And especially for people that are on fixed incomes, you know, a landlord can raise something. We don't know where SMI or AMI is going to go necessarily, but if you're on a fixed income, you kind of need to know that, you know, for longer range planning. And if Social Security gets cut off or something, you know, how are you going to deal with that? But it's a lot easier when you have control over the situation. So I'd like to give people as much control over their living situation as possible.
And the only reason I didn't include rehab in this is just because there's already existing programs in the
Yeah.
city that assist with that. I mean, that can probably be expanded elsewhere too. I know that was when we did the East Norwalk
but
plan. we talked about
we don't have a lot of open space. We're having this issue right now. There really is not a lot of open space. So in order to build more units or more large units, we're gonna have to tear some things down. So in some places that might be a good thing, but that's kind of rehabbing too, right? We're not building on empty land at this point. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I would classify that as new construction. So if someone tore something down and built new, that's probably how I would classify that.
But where new construction is matters, right? You don't want to, you know, we have a mall that we tore down, you weren't around, but we tore down a lot of little neighborhoods and we have a mall. So, you know, in a lot of sense, where we tear things down to build new construction is really important too. I'd like to see a little bit of focus on how you're upgrading the neighborhood overall with new construction. And I don't know how to do that. Do you know what I'm saying?
I mean,
Yeah,
I think this is maybe goes back to some of the conversation we had maybe 2 months ago about sort of the middle housing, right? The duplexes, the quads, the townhouses, the ways in which you can have an increase in density that is meaningful in terms of being able to get more homes for folks, but still, you know, it isn't overwhelmingly dense, you know, still maintains some of the character of, you know, the surrounding neighborhoods. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some buildings that could rightfully be torn down that should be more of a focus for being torn down and rebuilt on, whereas there are some more, you know, structures that are more historic that should be rehabbed. And I think on some level, you know, somebody coming in and I don't know, taking care of a brownfield site, for example, I know that's not part of this, should probably is gonna have to invest in that, right? So probably should be a little more weighted towards somebody that's willing to clean something up that's in a bad condition than building on the waterfront where there's nothing, you know?
Right. So an additional criteria for this funding could be, or you know, one of the scorings, you could get additional points if the property that you are proposing to build on is currently a blighted property.
Is gonna elevate the neighborhood overall as opposed to just that plot of land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and I would, if you, I think in my cover memo, I stated if you did not want to use the funds for larger projects and wanted to focus on smaller projects, I would be fine with that too. That could make sense if you wanted to keep it for under 20 units or whatever number you decided was appropriate.
And I certainly think that may be of interest to this committee. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the desire to, yeah, again, to help create the middle housing that is not currently being built, to incentivize projects that are currently having trouble finding, you know, sufficient funding, to encourage small local developers to maybe sort of have some competition for the kind of couple of big dominants. So I don't know if that I'm curious if other members of the committee had a reaction to that, but it did certainly to me, when I saw that in your email, Steve, it was certainly something that I thought, yes, this seems aligned with a lot of the things we've been talking about, you know, trying to help create some models of smaller projects that nonetheless really are meeting the criteria we're looking for in terms of what people are wanting to move into.
I think where I'm coming from is that you know, as part of my Red Cross disaster thing, I end up at a lot of homes that are way, way overoccupied that are probably, you know, maybe a 2, 3 family home, some of the bigger, older houses that are really not safe. that if you tore down that home and built 3 townhouses or 4 townhouses, or, you know, that for more density on that spot, you would actually improve the health and safety and quality of life for the people that live there currently and the surrounding homes too, is where I would like to see more of a focus.
Yeah, one thing I think they're not all online yet, they haven't been built, but we've seen a bunch of probably more two-family construction in the last year because of the zoning regulation changes and smaller developments than we've seen in a while. Like I said, they're not online yet, so we want to see what they look like when they're built because we spent a lot of time and had a lot of back and forth on particularly like the two families because that was a big issue. The one thing maybe that this pool of money can be used for is kind of helping somebody compete with the market because that will be, if you wanted to build like a duplex and have those available to somebody at like 60% SMI, for example, it's going to be hard to buy that and do that and then compete with somebody who's going to buy it and then just rent it at market price. So maybe these funds can help offset that difference.
And again, talking about creating more units, you know, maybe there's people who are like, oh, I'm going to build a nice new, you know, duplex. Well, maybe if you made it a triplex or, you know, it would be more, you know, it would help us build our housing stock a little bit in an area that it makes sense because there's already a lot of people living there. You know, and then it would comply with some of the parking regulations and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I think that this is sort of what, I think overall this does sort of reflect what I think this committee has been sort of moving towards and grappling with. I mean, that is what we want to see, I think. And certainly if this funding can be used to help, again, as you say, Steve, create some models, show how it can be done, at a level that, helps compete with the market. The more models we have of people doing it, the more, people can envision it, the more perhaps affordable they can make it. I know that I've, walking around the city doing door knocking over the last few months, I've seen some very interesting examples of some really great duplexes, some really great, like, little, like, I would call them almost like townhouse clusters. Like it'll be a cluster of like 3 houses with like a couple of like, but then like 2 or 3 clusters of those 3 houses with like a shared kind of yard and driveway space that I found very appealing, and I thought seemed like a very good use of the land, of sort of balancing that kind of having more density but still feeling very open and feeling like people had their own private spaces. And to Heather's point, safer construction. We're going really off topic, but this is part of why I fought hard against the demolition ordinance a couple of years ago, because not all old housing is safe housing. Not all old housing is worth preserving, right? Just because it's old doesn't mean that it has historic value. And I think sometimes we forget that. So I don't disagree with you on that, Heather. I don't. Oh.
You know, what landlord's going to tear it down if they don't have to fix it up and they can still get exorbitant rents? But, if we incentivize them, maybe even tearing it down and rebuilding something that's nicer and safer, that, is deed restricted, that kind of incentive might work.
Yeah, and one thing, I know, again, that we're the first time you're kind of going through this, and what I tried to do and it probably could use a little more tightening up as well, is trying not to make the criteria too subjective, because I think that's where any agency that's kind of scoring something gets into trouble sometimes, is if it's too subjective. So I think that just kind of keep that in mind how we look at things.
But is there any criteria in here that talks about, what they are on the tax rolls, whether it's in poor condition, good condition?
Yeah, there's 2 criteria. So number 8 is if they're not paying their taxes, then they're not eligible. So that's kind of one thing. And then the 5th one would be you can't be in violation of health, blight, or zoning to apply.
Yeah, but I know that when we tear down house, I know that we went through this with the mall properties. they were trying to designate a lot of the houses as in, really poor condition in order to say that they could be torn down. So I know there is the aspect of what is on the books as far as what your tax assessment says your property condition is, right?
Well, and the other interesting point that Heather's raising is that maybe we want to incentivize the fixing up of blighted properties. So we'd have to think about how to do that, but we don't want to be rewarding people who have maintained blighted properties, but we do want to reward people who, and maybe it's people who have not themselves caused the blight, but have acquired a property that has been blighted and are willing to do the work to clean up that blighted property. I mean, maybe that's a way of thinking about it. A new acquisition of a blighted property would potentially be something we would incentivize.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you don't want somebody that's had a property and left it in a blighted condition for 10 years and like, oh, look, the city's now giving me $1 million. And so I'll
Right.
put a new facade on. That's not what
Maybe
I think.
blighted because they couldn't afford to do anything. Maybe they've had the property for 60 years, but don't have the finances to actually upgrade it to something at a good level. Nikki's
Yeah,
got.
that's a double-edged sword too, just because then it just, I think, to the like kind of the beginning of the conversation, if they did use these funds, would that mean then they'd have to deed restrict their unit, and then does that hurt them in terms of building the equity they were hoping to get? So there's a lot of little things that could happen to have impacted both sides.
And and this is yet another conversation to talk about maybe, leaning into and potentially expanding the home front problem to kind of help folks who are in that situation, right? Because that does seem like a slightly different thing than, I don't know that these funds are really intended to go to an individual per se. But anyway, Nicole, you've had your hand up for a moment.
Yes, and I think we've spoken about this, and I just cannot recall at this hour. What about properties that may be commercial but could be converted to residential? How does this help those individuals, if at any way?
I think it would still be applicable because they, provided the units complied with the standards of the affordability requirements. I mean, are you thinking of looking at it as like an incentive to do more of that?
I've heard tonight much conversation about the tearing down and the rebuilding, but Norwalk, and we've said this numerous of times, is not getting any more land. There's no more land going to show up, and so we're gonna have to, I believe, my opinion, reappropriate some things that we already have. And so we do have commercial space, large parcels of commercial space that are vacant, not being used for commercial goods or any goods at all, that maybe if it is incentivized in the right way, could be turned into rental properties.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think the more we add, the more units we add, that would also help if I'm understanding it correctly. The more units we add to our inventory, that would also help the rent to go down, which is another problem. Our rents are very high, and a lot of people are not able to afford them.
Right. Yeah. And it, and certainly, and this, I mean, I think that in many ways, your comments and Heather's comments kind of dovetail, right? I think we all can visualize in our head blighted commercial properties in the city that we drive by and think this could be used so much better. There is so much that could be done with this space. There's so much value. And, and really that might be a target in some ways of this funding. So certainly things to consider. I know we are at 7. I really want to get to one more thing before we close our business for the night, but very quickly. We had talked about this committee making a recommendation to the mayor, current or upcoming, I guess, for an appropriation in the capital budget for affordable housing. And just to refresh everyone's recollection, That was a thing that used to happen. At some point in the last 5 to 10 years, it stopped happening. It was never a ton of money. I think it was in the neighborhood of $250,000, maybe not even that much. But in particular, as I understand it, it typically went to the Norwalk Housing Authority, and was used by them to be able to do planning for, or primarily at least, used to do planning for new projects or for redesign of projects, because that is a cost that they have a great deal of difficulty finding any other funder to cover, is sort of that very initial stage. That may or may not be what we would want to do or recommend, but the question is sort of, would this committee like to make a recommendation that the capital budget for the coming year include an appropriation for affordable housing? And if so, what appropriation would we like to recommend? And would we like it to be specified for, sort of a particular, it would need to be specified for a particular agency, whether it's redevelopment, whether it's the Norwalk Housing Authority, whether it is to add to this existing funds that we are currently building up to sort of strengthen the ability to do more with that. So I know we're really running short of time, but do folks have reactions to this? Do people have ideas? Is this something the committee wants to pursue? Because if so, we need to do so in the next month or two in order to have any impact on the budget development.
I just want to quickly say, and then I have to jump off because I have at 7 o'clock, but I was trying to finish this one before
Yeah.
I apologize in advance. I do think there should be an allocation. My question, I think it needs to be more discussion. Where does that allocation go? I don't know if comfortable is the right word. I don't know how happy I would be to allocate money for affordable housing for it to go to the housing authority, because that's a certain type of housing that, not that is not needed, but we have people who are middle class people who are not eligible for affordable housing, and then we're already giving something that is heavily subsidized more resources. Not saying that they're not deserving, but we have other pools and pockets of people that I think we might need to look at that are not able to get anything, that could really use some help. So again, I do think there should be an appropriation in the budget, but I would like to have more conversation about where we're sending that appropriation to.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ayers. I appreciate that. Other folks who want to weigh in on that point? Ms. Edie.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree with what Nicole just said. Thinking of middle housing, also seniors who might be, downsizing, who now fit in that middle housing as well, where they're stuck in between. I think that that would be great to concentrate on that area, because they don't want to leave the area either, like many of us don't. So yeah, and we just need to discuss where, but I agree with what she just said. So thank you.
Okay. Ms. Dunn, Mr. Seed, thoughts?
Without any, in a vacuum, I think it sounds like a good idea, but in a perfect world, if I had $250,000, I think, jumping off of what you just said, like $250,000, you're right. If we gave it to the senior center, could they distribute it for, oil relief or gas relief? I don't know that it would be the most effective use of that money. So I don't know at this point. I'm not ready to make a decision about that, but we do have limited funds. We have a huge tax bill coming to people and the federal government. I don't know. I'm really worried about our budget as it is. So I'd want to be making sure that whatever we tried to allocate was not being taken from somewhere else that could be more effective. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. And I think, to be clear, the idea was to make a capital, not an operating. So that couldn't be used, for instance, for heating. It would have to be used basically for construction. So the idea is sort of, is there an effective way to help make an investment in building more affordable housing. And again, the part of the question may be, do we have the appropriate vehicle in Norwalk right now? And the answer may be we don't. I mean, to Ms. Edie and Ms. Ayer's point, we really don't have a entity that does middle housing right now, you know? So I'm not sure that we can't, you know, but anyway, so let's keep talking about it, but I just want to get that on your radar. I think this will be a topic for November. I know that we are running late, so let's jump off here. I'll take but we will, oh, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, Michelle and I were talking, you might want to maybe see if Michelle Condorino is available to attend your next meeting. They're doing the project on Maple Street, it's the 4-unit.
Yes.
So, and I know there's a lot of subsidy there, but it might be worth kicking some of this around with her.
I think that's a great idea. I'd really like to get a presentation on that project and quite frankly, on the housing, what did you call it? The financing stack or the finance stack for that. I think would actually could be very insightful for this committee in general to see how did they do it? You know, where did the sources, how's that all lining up? I think that's a great idea, Steve. Let's plan on that. Any other comments before we take a motion to adjourn? All right. Anyone want to make the motion? Thank you, Mr. Seed. I appreciate it. All those in favor? All right, it's unanimous. Thank you all very much. Have a good night. We will talk soon.
Thank
Night.
you.
Bye.
Have a good night.